Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another episode review from the Haunting Hour television show. I actually have two episodes I'm going to be discussing here, but I treat them as a two-parter because, in terms of canon and continuity between the episodes, they kind of flow like a two-parter. Both of these stories were written by Scott Thomas and Jed Elinoff, and the first episode was directed by James Head in season one, and in season three, Jason Furukawa, I think that's how you say their name, directed the second part. And the episodes in question is The Dead Body and Dead Bodies. So if you don't know anything about the Dead Body episode, it was one of the first episodes in season one, and it was one of those episodes that kind of brought some mainstream attention to the Haunting Hour on the Hub Network. Now, to my knowledge, the episode received some backlash from parents and also fan appraisal who wanted to see the story continue. So that hype and buzz brought back Jed Elinoff and Scott Thomas to write a follow-up to this episode from season one, and it debuted in season three. And it picked up 3 months after the events of the first episode. And upon watching both of these stories, I've always thought, ever since I watched these for the first time way back in the day when I was in high school, that this is like an unofficial two-parter in the Haunting Hour, and that's how I still treat it. That's why I'm putting them together in this review. And also another fun fact about The Dead Body, I think it's a story adaptation, or a loose one I should say, from a story that was included in the Nightmare Hour collection that R.L. Stine put out, I think, in 1999. So there is a short story out there. I'm going to wait to review that short story and do a comparison with these episodes for the future, because I want to save that collection for a little bit. So if you're expecting a short story versus episode, or episodes in this case, you're going to have to wait. So with that being said, The Dead Body and Dead Bodies are fan-revered episodes from the Haunting Hour, and I have to say, like most of the fan-revered ones, this one does have some merit, and it does hold up today. And I still think that it's, especially when you put them together, it's one of the Haunting Hour's strongest episodes out there, in my opinion. It might not be perfect. It does have some flaws. Yes, some people out there might be upset that I'm saying it has some flaws, but I'm just going to speak on them how I feel. With that out the way, I definitely recommend that you go check out these episodes, especially if you've never seen The Haunting Hour before. There are plenty of good gateway episodes out there, like Dreamcatcher, Mascot, Really You / Return of Lily D, Pumpkinheads, the list goes on. But this two-parter will kind of show you the writing talent that was on this show and what they were able to create. And honestly, if you want to go check out the short story as well, feel free, because it's also kind of fun in its own little way as well, but very different compared to his episode's counterparts. So just know that before you go into it. So let's start off with the plot overview of these episodes without giving too much away. So The Dead Body starts off with the main character, Will. And Will, he, I guess, is like a freshman or maybe sophomore in high school. So this is one of the episodes that you'll see in the Haunting Hour that will remind you of another 90s kids horror show like Are You Afraid of the Dark, where it was more of a catch-all type of show where there was a bunch of different age brackets of main characters throughout it. And this one actually has some high school kids in it, so go figure. But Will, he has this crush on this girl named Anna, but at the same time, he is getting bullied by these two guys that are pretty much pricks. And one day, he's out in the hallway listening to music, and you hear the Going Through Changes song by Army of Me. If you don't know who that band is, they used to tour with Paramore in the mid-2000s. It rings my nostalgia bells every time I hear the opening of this episode. But nonetheless, he gets stopped by his bullies. He literally gets shoved off, kind of embarrassed, and his crush kind of evades him because he's trying to track her down to ask her a question. And the question is, of course, if she's interested to go to the spring fling with him. Well, after this event happens, we get to see this character outside the school. He's combing his hair, kind of like a greaser. And this character, we later come to find out, is a character played by Matt Angel. And Matt Angel, if you don't know this about the actor, he is essentially the son of Dan Angel from the duo Dan Angel and Billy Brown, who were head writers on the Goosebumps show from the 90s and on The Haunting Hour. And this character ends up being this kid named Jake Skinner. And throughout the rest of the story, after this event happens, Jake notices that this behavior is going on. And while Will is walking home one day, and after he has another interaction, Jake kind of confronts him and says, hey, you should maybe do something about it. And Will kind of shrugs Jake off and like, I don't know you, but thanks anyway. He goes to school later on. He is in his science class. He sees his crush. He's trying to build up courage to, ask her something. He tries whispering. She doesn't answer. So he tries to confront her in the hallway when she goes to her locker. But when this happens, the bullies come over to him and throw water in his crotch, make him look like he peed himself. And he gets embarrassed in front of his crush. And this makes him angry. And then he's confronted by Jake again, saying, shake my hand. Let's make a deal. If I do you a favor, I can handle these guys, and all I ask in return is that you return the favor when I need you to. So Will takes Jake up on his offer, shakes his hand, and Jake and Will come up with this plan to essentially pull a prank on the bullies when they have a field trip going out into the woods later on in the episode. While the kids are all out there, the bullies, Will and his crush are out there, and they stumble across what they think is a dead body. This, of course, scares the bullies. It kind of separates Will and his crush from them as well. And they look to try to find help to essentially get an adult to help out. But once all the other kids scatter, Will, thanks the dead corpse, who ends up being Jake, for his services. And when Will tries to catch up with his crush, we get to see the bully, at least the main bully, get kind of cornered by an invisible entity and kind of scared relentless to the point where he's now going to pull himself from school when he's discovered by his classmates. And Will's crush, is informed by Will that this was a prank, but she's like, what exactly did the prank involve? And as the story carries on in school later on, it kind of comes to a point after, Will brings up the courage to ask his crush to go to the dance with him, and she agrees. She's kind of worried about maybe Will and Jake took things a little too far. Well, at this point of the story now, the story kind of picks up a little more pace. We get to see the second bully working out in school, but there's a janitor that also works there. I've already skimmed over this fact a little bit, but as Will starts to, talk about this guy, this janitor overhears the name, and he says, Jake, he died in 1961, and Will goes over to this cabinet in the hallway, sees a picture of Jake, and then he's confronted by Jake, and Jake reveals that he's actually dead, and this freaks Will out to the point where he's trying to find answers, and the only person he thinks he can go to is the janitor. The janitor kind of informs of the tragedy of what happened to Jake Skinner and how it involved a tragic accidental gym fire that resulted from bullying from these two guys when Jake tried to get revenge on him, and that may have resulted in Jake's death. But as Will learns this information, he's trying to leave school, and he hears Jake screaming. He wanders into this kind of alternate reality of sorts. I guess it's the night of the dance at the same time going on, and he sees Jake being hazed by these guys wearing like early 1960s attire, and they throw firecrackers, start the fire, leave, and Jake is, in distress, so Will decides to help him, but there's a plot twist involved with that, that essentially Jake is collecting on his favor, and let's just say Will is now trading places with Jake in the moment that he died, and it's implied what that means near the end of the part 1 episode here when Will, tries to save him. Jake leaves. He ends up kind of suffocating and going unconscious. When he wakes up, he realizes the dance is going on. He tries to go find his date in the auditorium or gymnasium. And he realizes that she's not responding to him. But then she sees Jake and her talking. And they start to dance. And they phase right through his body. And there's a realization that he's dead. Or maybe a ghost now, like Jake was. And Jake says, now we're even. So that basically wraps up part 1. And then in part 2, there's a 3-month time skip that we learn kind of in the middle of the episode, but in the beginning, it starts off with Jake Skinner in the hallway, kind of looking in that glass cabinet from the first episode, seeing a picture of himself. He breaks through the glass to take the picture, I guess, to destroy the evidence that he was dead before. And, the credits roll, the episode starts, and we see Jake outside of the school waiting by his new Mustang, and he's waiting on Will's crush from part 1. And then we see Will and Jake kind of talking, and Will, he is struggling to keep his ghost form. He kind of phases in and out of existence because he has to, find a will to hang on and, I guess, haunt. And the only person that can see him at that moment is Jake, I guess because he was formerly dead. And almost immediately, we get more context already into the story based on part 1 that was kind of missing there, of why Jake did what he did. And he said, look, I was dead for 50 years. You were impressionable. You were looking, kind of like me. And I've been waiting all this time for a gullible kid to kind of fall for my plan because I deserve to live and I have the guts to get the girl. You don't. And that plays into, Will's struggle in part 1 with asking his crush out. Well, now Jake has pretty much stolen his girl, made him his girlfriend, and all that. And this has really upset Will. And throughout the episode, Will is kind of taunting Jake and saying that, you're wasting your time. She doesn't like you. It's only a matter of time before, we're going to switch back. And Jake's like, I'm not switching back. And he's putting out, his arm saying, I'm not going to do it. You had your chance. You fell for it. Just deal with it. Well, early on, Jake feels like Will has possibly created some new powers out of the event. And there's like a whole poltergeist activity event that's going on and involving an auto shop. And Jake seems to think that it's Will, and he's kind of impressed. But then he's greeted by like this Harry Potter Dementor type demon that pretty much holds his arm and burns him, saying that, Jake Skinner, you're mine, you're supposed to be with me, blah, blah, blah. And Jake has now been marked by, I guess, the Grim Reaper Dementor coming to collect on his body. Later on, you kind of learn the context of he's cheated death, essentially, or escaped death, and or the afterlife. And death is trying to, I guess, make it right by, exposing what his true body is like. Well, as the story goes along, we get to see kind of more a more emotional side of Will as he's kind of coping in his existence. He's kind of hanging out in his crush's room. She's looking at the yearbook that came out, I guess, a few months prior, and there's a in memoriam thing in the yearbook of Will's mysterious disappearance 3 months prior and how saddening it is. And Will's kind of spilling out exactly what happened. He's like, I didn't disappear. I was tricked by Jake, and all this terrible stuff happened to me, and I'm going to try to make it right because I want to protect you from this guy. Well, that kind of plays into essentially, as the story goes along, you start to see Jake start to panic a little bit in his current state. His arm is starting to decay in his wrist, and it's really gross in that body horror type of way. And he's waiting out in his car because he's panicked, and he wants to spend time with his girlfriend, I guess, because maybe he has a new idea. And Will ends up in his car and says, you're wasting your time. Looks like death had already gotten to you because Will witnessed the event earlier. And he's like, you're losing your attractiveness. You're going to be like me anyway. So you wasted your time. And Jake, of course, is like, all right, well, challenge accepted. The girl gets into his car. They end up driving over to a secluded cliff where Jake puts on a hood and he's telling her, like, hey, can you make a deal with me? If you do me a favor, if you do me a favor, I'll return it, kind of thing. And she's like, well, what's the catch? And he's become more increasingly agitated, and Will's trying to intervene. And then during this, Will kind of makes his presence known. She questions it, and Jake starts to kind of mutate even further. And this time, the decayedness of his arm has spread to his face, and now he looks more decayed than ever. She freaks out in a respectable way, and she tries to flee from Jake, and this whole altercation happens. And then Will finally finds his calling of staying in existence. He makes his presence known to his crush, tells her to run, tries to fend off Jake. They get into a scuffle. Will gets temporarily taken out of the situation. Jake may or may not catch up to his girl, and something may or may not happen involving the Dementor from earlier, and we get to see possibly a grisly fate for a certain character, and kind of a bait and switch thing for another character that's completely changed, and we get kind of like a kumbaya ending for the story, and then a surprise stinger ending that kind of just throws a random monkey wrench in the equation. But that's essentially what you're going to expect out of the entire Dead Body story when you watch The Dead Body and Dead Bodies as one concentric episode. So, yeah, after, going over that plot synopsis, I guess I can kind of make my point clear of why I combine these episodes. And like I said, this is probably the only time I'm ever going to do this, because unlike the other sequel episodes in the Haunting Hour TV show, this one feels like it's just adding an additional episode and making it a two-parter. And I feel like Dead Bodies really does add on to, The Dead Body, the original episode, in a significant way that you kind of need both, knowing that Dead Bodies exists, right? So that's why I did this. But I have to say off the bat that I think the writing team here, did a fantastic job planning out the original episode, I guess. But definitely with the second episode, Dead Bodies, the hindsight, I think that they saw the potential in the story to add on more context that was missing in part one. And especially with Dead Bodies included, this story really builds together and it starts to crescendo if you treat it like a two-parter. So the writing team here deserve a lot of credit. Both directors of these episodes did a great job. There's some fantastic shots in both of these. There's some great practical effects on Jake in part 2 that I really enjoyed. There's some mildly dated CGI in part 1, but we do get to see some really scary scenes in part 1 as well, involving Jake in his invisible form and how he's taunting a bully, or the other bully when he kind of, makes this CGI face at him. It's still kind of creepy, and both episodes have that, creepy quality, but The Dead Bodies played more on that supernatural fear, while Dead Bodies is more playing on existential horror and body horror. And I think that's a good dichotomy to have in both parts, and I really like that both episodes bring their own element of horror. The acting here from the main cast, Matt Angel is a showstopper. His performance as Jake Skipper has to be one of the top 5 performances in the whole show. The main character, I forget his name, who plays Will, he's really good. I think Tiara Skovby, who plays, the love interest Anna of the story, she's even riveting as well. And those are pretty much the 3 main characters of the entire episodes. And they really do have a good narrative here. And it's one of those more emotional Haunting Hour episodes as a whole, because part 1 starts off with Will kind of in his insecurity, going through the woes of life, trying to impress a girl, but he's getting bested by bullies, getting embarrassed. He falls into the wrong crowd. And then part 2 really does build on that, and how that wrong crowd was just trying to use him, take advantage of him, and take from him, essentially. And it does have some good thematic messages in the story about being taken advantage of and toxic friendships and all of that. And I really do think that it sends a powerful message in the story. And Will's journey is incredible. And seeing Jake's fall from grace, while it's tragic of what happened to him, is really satisfying. And getting that kumbaya happy ending is actually worthwhile. So it feels like a whole story. It's pretty much, functionally a perfect story that you can possibly come up with for kids' horror. But there is some issues here. There is some issues in both parts carried over. I will kind of get into each part's weaknesses over the other, but I'm going to start off with part 1 here. I think part 1's biggest weakness to it, all right? And this is the thing that, might be subjective to fans out there who love part 1 for how dark it is and just how mean-spirited it is and all that. But the first thing that I have an issue with in part 1 was that there's no context as to why Jake is coming after Will. It's all revealed in part 2, and it's cleared up there. But in part 1, like I said, without part 2, part 1 really does suffer a little bit, in my opinion, because it doesn't make sense why Jake would identify with Will, especially given the whole backstory that you learn about Jake being part of a tragedy due to bullying, and how he's willing to take over a kid that was also being bullied. It just makes no sense why he isn't targeting a bully to take over if all you need to do is just trade place with existing, right? And that also ties into the element of that itself. There is a thing in the episode that makes zero logical sense from this episode onto the second one. And that is the fact that Jake Skinner died in 1961. There's a photo of him in this glass cabinet. However, Will, he lives in present day, and I think the timeline is 2010. He goes missing in 2010, and everybody in the timeline in present day acknowledged that he still exists and all of that, but there's a whole scene where he's kind of transported to the past, or the scene of Jake's death, and it doesn't make sense on how that happens. It's just there in the story. They essentially swap places, and then the story continues, still not making sense, because the beginning of part 2, Jake is taking his photo out of the glass cabinet. So, what exactly were you trying here? the whole going to the past element, I think, just really convolutes the story. Why does Jake's photo still exist if he replaced himself in the past with Will? And how does Will still exist in the present? I mean, it makes sense that Will would exist, but why isn't Jake's photo erased from the glass cabinet? I don't know why that's a thing. It's just a thing in the episode. It's glossed over, but the motives and all of that are still sound and clear. It's more cleared up. There's another detriment to part 1 is that you don't really get a sense of Jake's motives, like I said, but part 2 clears that up. So he says that I took your place because you remind me of myself, and I'm willing to get the girl and you're not. And I guess it's more driven by a love interest. And I feel like the biggest hindsight issue with both of these episodes, especially for part 1, not more so part 2, should have been the fact that if they had some hindsight, some 2020 vision in all of this, they would have played up more of the love interest angle with Jake and Anna in the story of part 1. And that kind of would have helped the context there as a standalone even more so. But when you compare part 1 to part 2, you're like, why are they dumping all of this information in this episode, and why was it completely absent here? And for that, I'm really fortunate that Dead Bodies exists, because it clears up a lot of things, and honestly, they picked the natural progression that I would have come to in the story either way. But that's neither here or there. It's just there's a little too much convolution in that area of the story, too many moving parts, and lack of hindsight to kind of connect these things to make it more coherent across both episodes. And also, I will throw this out, but I'm not going to deduct points on it. The Stinger ending is completely random, given the context of what we see happen to Jake in Dead Bodies episode, which is the second part. The ending overall, the Stinger, makes no sense. But it's there as kind of like a mockery thing to mock Stinger endings, and you can get that sense from it when you watch it. But the fact that that's there is also another questionable thing. But at least it kind of throws an idea of sequel bait out there, and I'll just leave it there and be as vague as possible about that. But yeah, I mean, at least I can see the charm in it. If I didn't, I might be a little harsher on it. But nonetheless, this 2-part episode, The Dead Body and Dead Bodies, I had a great time with. I thought this was a great episode, not without its flaws. So from a 0 to 5-star basis, I looked at it like this. Part 1 by itself, I'd probably give like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. But part 2, where I think it had a better story, better emotions, better arc, clearer motives there established, better body horror, just stuff that I look for more, I'd probably give that about a 4.8 out of 5 stars. So when I decided to combine these in terms of score, I was like, well, I'm going to try to meet myself in the middle. And I decided on the higher end of that middle, and I gave it a 4.7 out of 5 stars. I think that this, by default, would be in my top 10 of the Haunting Hour television show, just for how strong this two-parter is. It's not my favorite episode by any means. It does have some flaws to it, but this is an episode that is clearly rewatchable, and it's revisitable for the right reasons. It brings me back to when I first fell in love with the show. I love Matt Angel's performance. I love the story that it tells, despite its flaws, across both episodes, and I have a fun time every time I watch it. So, like I said before, if you've never checked out The Dead Body and Dead Bodies from the Haunting Hour TV show, please go take the time to do so. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Dead Bodies / Dead Bodies. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen these episodes, or this two-parter, let's just say it like that. Do you love it or do you hate it? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.